Welcome, everyone, to the Block Center's convening of what I think you will agree is a very impressive panel of experts who have gathered to discuss the spread of automation and its ongoing impacts on the labor market. I'm Katharine Abraham. I'm a distinguished university professor at the University of Maryland, a former commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and a member of the Block Center for Technology and Society's External Advisory Committee. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to moderate today's conversation, which is part of an ongoing series of events the Block Center is sponsoring on the future of work. For those of you who are not familiar with the Block Center, it's a university-wide center housed at Carnegie Mellon's Heinz College of Information Systems and Public Policy. It focuses on how emergent technologies will alter the future of work, how AI and analytics can be harnessed for social good, and how innovation in these spaces can be more inclusive and contribute to solutions that reduce inequality and improve the quality of life for everyone. We are honored to be joined today by three distinguished panelists who bring a diverse set of perspectives from government, business, and academia on the questions I hope we'll address. What official statistics tell us about the spread of automation, what we can learn from other types of data about how automation is changing the opportunities available to workers, and whether tech-driven changes in the labor market demand new policies to protect or reskill workers. Let me introduce the panelists in turn. First, Nicole Nestoriak is a senior research economist at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Her research interests focus on how information on working conditions and worker requirements can lead to insights about labor market behavior. Nicole received her PhD from the University of Maryland, go Maryland, and she's previously worked at the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Bledi Taska is Executive Vice President and Chief Economist at Lightcast. He's a labor economist specializing in the application of econometrics and data science methods to real-time labor market data. At Lightcast, Bledi leads a team of economists and data scientists who support the company's public policy research, product development, and collaboration with academic researchers and international organizations. Bledi holds a doctorate in economics from New York University. And third, Erik Brynjolfsson, who is a professor at Stanford and the director of the Stanford Digital Economy Lab at the Institute for Human-Centered AI. He's also, among his many other activities, a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and holds appointments at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and the Stanford Department of Economics. Erik is one of the most widely cited researchers studying the digital economy. He's the co-author of 5 books, including The Second Machine Age. He holds a PhD from MIT in managerial economics. Please join me in welcoming these panelists. Let me start with you, Nicole, if I can. The Bureau of Labor Statistics is the agency that members of the public rely on for objective information about the labor market. What kinds of data does the BLS collect that are helpful for understanding how automation and technological change more generally affect the labor market? And what are some of the key things that you think those data tell us?
Yeah, thanks, Katharine. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics has a long history of studying the impact of automation on the labor market. Way back in the late 1800s, the Commissioner of Labor received a request from Congress to investigate and report upon the effects of the use of machinery upon labor. In the intervening decades, there have been many subsequent requests, and most recently in 2019, the Senate expressed concern that there continues to be insufficient data to study the impact of technology on the American workforce, and the committee encouraged BLS to develop a data strategy to better understand how automation, digitization, and artificial intelligence are changing the employment landscape. So first, I'll spend a little bit of time talking about what existing data products BLS has that help address these questions. And I'll shift a little bit to talk about our current project that's looking at developing this data strategy. So much of the BLS data is well covered in the press. The monthly jobs report provides information on things like non-farm payroll employment from an establishment survey that offers a bunch of industry detail. Labor force statistics are available by worker demographics from a household survey, and these are closely followed. The job openings and labor turnover survey has additional information on job openings, hires, and separations by industry and by some levels of geography as well. And this provides information on labor demand and job turnover. Detailed occupational data is available from the Occupational Employment and Wage Statistics Program, which provides employment and wage estimates for over 800 occupations for the nation, states, and more detailed geography. National data is also available by industry from the same program. The National Employment Matrix tabulates this data and provides occupation by industry level employment numbers. These occupation by industry tabulations are then also used to feed into the employment projections program, which then extend these numbers out 10 years into the future to determine where we think the labor force is headed in that time range. So beyond these counts of employment and measuring wages, BLS also has additional data that goes in a little bit more detail about workers and what they're doing. The Occupational Requirements Survey publishes information on specific work-related requirements on education, training, and experience, cognitive and mental requirements, physical demands, environmental conditions. And additionally, the survey collects text data on the critical tasks of a job. And finally, there are other surveys that focus on the American Time Use Survey, for example. The National Longitudinal Surveys follow cohorts of individuals over time. And there's even data on things like worker injuries and illnesses that give a sense of the working conditions that are faced by the population. So shifting a little bit to our current work, as part of addressing the request from Congress to better understand the labor market, BLS is undertaking a series of case studies to allow for in-depth qualitative analysis on the impact automation is having on workers, and we picked 3 specific sectors to narrow it down a little bit. And we're looking at establishments in transportation and warehousing sector, retail trade, and healthcare. The interviews with these establishments will focus on technologies that were recently adopted, not necessarily cutting edge, we're just looking for new adoption of technology, that the respondent has identified that impacts the jobs and tasks that workers are performing at their establishment. Mm-hmm. So and then finally, these interviews will cover how the workers and technology interact with each other, the impact of technology on job skills and training, and the impact of the technology on product quality, productivity, and worker health. So then what do these data tell us about the impact of automation on the labor market? So many researchers, both inside and outside of BLS, have used all this data to look at the impact of automation and what they tell us about the distribution of wages over time, wages by different skill levels, rising and falling unemployment by different occupations, and other details of workers' jobs. As for what the data show, there's been some concerns that the pandemic would increase the pace of automation, but it doesn't appear, it's not yet apparent in the data. So the overall picture of the labor market suggests that there's very high levels of demand right now, as measured by the JOLTS data. Openings are at all-time highs, unemployment is very low, and there are still rapid monthly job gains. Looking over longer timeframes, there's a recent article in the Monthly Labor Review, which is put out by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, that looked at growth trends by occupation over the past 20 years, and then also in the projections time period. So what do we expect in the next 10 years? And they found that there are not, over these past 10 years, there were not any like structural breaks, large changes across broad groups of occupations due to technology change. Even looking specifically at occupations where one might expect there was an impact from automation or AI, there are certainly occupations that are less prevalent in a relative sense, or have even decreased levels of employment at this point, but there aren't these large breaks that people seem concerned about. And certainly there are limitations in predicting future changes based on these past experiences. But what we have seen so far suggests that the impact of technology is felt gradually over time. The projections show, going out in the next 10-year time period that there are absolute and relative declines in employment by specific occupations, but not these large scale breaks in what we see in the data.
Interesting. One thing that really strikes me in your opening remarks, Nicole, is the fact that that the impact of technology on the labor market is far from a new issue. It really was part of the motivation, as you said, for the creation of the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the first place back in the 1880s. So I'm also really interested in this qualitative work that the BLS is embarking on. That seems like somewhat of a departure for the BLS.
So I think it's a departure from recent times what BLS has focused on, but as we mentioned, that these requests from Congress to what is the impact of automation on the labor market, these types of studies had been done in the past, and so sort of resurrecting that older methods, I guess, partly so that we learn more, and also, if we're going to undertake any additional data collection, it'll certainly be helpful to understand what can respondents tell us, and that would be useful for addressing this question.
Yeah, no, it seems like a really good idea. Bledi, Lightcast has really been, turning to different types of data, has really been a leader in using, big data to shed light on changes in the labor market that may or may not show up in the data that Nicole just talked about. At least not with the same timeliness or the same granularity. Could you talk a little bit about the data you work with and how those data have been useful to better understand what's going on in the labor market?
Absolutely, and thank you. Try to make this simple. We collect real-time, what we call real-time labor market data. And in a simple way, we collect all online job postings in US and in other countries. And we do three things that add value to this type of data. We aggregate from many sources, so the data is robust, and one source actually does not affect the data too much. We deduplicate the data because, again, a lot of job postings appear in many sources. And then, most importantly, we extract information that is in the text data, so we transform the textual data into structured data. So to put that in a simple way, we assign a job posting occupation code and industry code. We extract the salary information, we extract the skill information. So this is sort of the data that we have, and we're talking about, in US, to give you a ballpark, around 50 million observations per year that we track over many years. And the simple way that you use the data is to see how the labor market is changing. And one of the most significant use cases, that one that is related to this discussion, is to understand how technology and technology adoption and diffusion is evolving over time. And we do that using what we call the skills or technology data. And the idea behind that is something simple that essentially, Erik and other researchers have started that, is that today investment in technology is very related to investment in talent, right? Today, you don't really need to invest in a lot of infrastructure, especially when you are trying to develop AI, for example, but you need to invest a lot in talent. And so understanding investment in talent essentially allows you to understand investment in technology that the companies are doing. A couple of comments, and so I'll relate this also with the discussion of Nicole, is that the data is complementary to the public data and the service that we have. And it's complementary in at least two ways. First of all, we need the public data to understand if we're doing the right thing. Again, there's a lot of noise, and the big data approach is very different than the traditional approach. So we need the survey data to essentially guide us if we're doing the right thing. But also there's a lot of different information. So just to give you the example of the ONET, which has the skilled information, to put it in a simplistic way, although there are nuances, the information that you have for technologies or skilled in ONET is about incumbent workers. It is what the workers have. And that is potentially very different to what employers are asking today. And actually, the difference on its own is very interesting. But the other point that we sort of touched upon is that survey data have large costs, and then sometimes they also have large lags into when are we seen, and this is the gaps that we're trying to fill. And they also lack sometimes the granularity. If you, for example, want to understand first different types of AI, that is a little bit difficult to do with more traditional data. If you want overall to understand the adoption and diffusion of AI, you can probably do that. I know, for example, Erik and other researchers have implemented, some additional surveys, but not everybody can do that. Again, yeah, that is extremely costly. And I'm going to stop it.
So I just had a couple of follow-up questions. So could you give an example of how you're using the job posting data to identify that a company is investing in a particular technology?
Yes, I mean, specifically for AI, and there's been a lot of papers by a lot of research at this moment. You first start with sort of the definition of the skills that essentially constitute AI and investment in AI. And that makes it a little bit tricky because, I'm going to talk there's still need to do some work to distinguish between the different types of AI. But let's assume that we have a set of keywords that essentially define investment or skills that somebody needs to do that. That could be, for instance, artificial intelligence to machine learning to computer vision, even more specific like PyTorch or NLP or other type of words. So you have a set of keywords that essentially constitute sort of like your encyclopedia of AI skills. Once you have that, then you can do the analysis. That is your technology index. And then you can start to see how that tracks over time, how it tracks over industries, how it tracks at different regions, if there are any wage premium associated with that, if there are any complementary skills, for example, associated with that. You can see other skills, for example, that are tracking together with this AI, for example, softer skills. So essentially, it starts by the definition of a technology, and that can be done with any type of technology. It can be done with AI. It can be done, for example, with other types like green skills. It can be done with blockchain. And all of these are research questions that our researchers have answered using our data.
Interesting. I have read some of these papers, and they are fascinating. So, Erik, let me turn to you. You have been talking and writing for a long time now about the potential for new technologies to change the way that people work. You've been looking at the technologies that are currently emerging. How do you expect these new technologies that we're seeing to affect the labor market? Do you think certain types of jobs are going to disappear, or do you think we're going to see some different kind of outcome?
Yes.
Okay.
but to elaborate, first off, thank you for that question. It's really, what I think is perhaps the most important question for our society right now. And also want to briefly thank Bledi and Nicole for helping me do my work so much better with the, I'll mention some of the BLS data I've been working in. And Bledi knows we've been working a lot with the BGT data and the other data, fine-grained data sets. So today we have, I think, more powerful technologies than we've ever had in history, especially artificial intelligence, and they're in the midst of transforming work in the economy quite fundamentally. As Nicole mentioned, this is not an entirely new issue. Historically, technology has always been destroying jobs. It's also always been creating jobs and transforming jobs. And that's because tech doesn't just replace labor or automate tasks. It can also augment labor and allow us to do new things and create new value in new ways. But the outcomes depend critically on our policy and our managerial choices, and been working on trying to understand that better. I recently wrote a paper called The Turing Trap: The Promise and Peril of Human-like Intelligence, where I dive into this. As you know, the Turing test is this idea that we can make machines that imitate perfectly what humans do. I think that's the wrong way to think about what we want to do with technology. It's a trap. And I've also been working with Tom Mitchell at Carnegie Mellon and Daniel Rock, who's now at Wharton, about what machine learning can do and the workforce implications. We published a paper in Science on that. And we developed a framework we call the Suitability for Machine Learning Framework. We went through each of the about 18,000 tasks and scored them in ONET on how suitable they were for machine learning, how likely machine learning could do them. We hear a lot about the power of AI. I just want to be clear. We're very far from artificial general intelligence that can just sort of do everything that people can do. But we do have human or even superhuman level intelligence in certain specific tasks. And there's a logic to that. Tasks that involve taking digital data, mapping inputs to outputs are things where machine learning techniques, supervised learning using large neural nets are able to do incredibly well. And there's been some breakthroughs the past decade or so in that in particular. So there are a number of tasks that we do that fit that. Famously, Jeff Hinton, who developed these deep learning systems, described reading medical images as one of those. And he said we should stop training radiologists because machines can, in many cases, diagnose cancer or other diseases from medical images as well or better than radiologists. But when you use the ONET framework and you use the framework that Tom Mitchell and Daniel Rock and I developed, you come to a different conclusion. A radiologist, according to ONET, do 26 distinct tasks. One of them, a very important one, is reading medical images, but they also consult with patients, they coordinate with other doctors, they sometimes do physical exams, they administer sedation. These are things we may not want a machine to be doing to us. And in fact, since Jeff Hinton made that prediction that we'd be getting rid of radiologists, there are more radiologists now than there were then. So
how interesting.
I think this is, an iconic example that we're not on the verge of mass unemployment or mass joblessness. Instead, we are seeing a lot of restructuring, and there are parts of jobs that are automated. And when you do reduce or eliminate the need for a human to do a particular task as part of a broader bundle in a job, you may actually increase the overall value of that job and lead to more people doing that. So this is something that happened a lot in history. When we invented jet engines, we didn't get rid of pilots. Pilots became more valuable. And I'm working with a company called Cresta that's using AI to help call center folks and augmenting what they can do. And it's increasing their wages and their value quite a bit. So I think that there's been an underemphasis on this idea of complementing or augmenting through these technologies, and overemphasis on mass replacement. Ultimately, you can use the technologies in different ways. And I talk to entrepreneurs and technologists that, in my opinion, are often overly focused on this automation, substitution, replacement, imitation mindset. I call it the Turing trap. And one of my missions lately is to get people to think more about complementing and augmenting that ultimately will make the pie bigger and create a lot more value. And it also, very importantly, leads to a better distribution. If you keep humans in the loop, then wages are likely to be preserved or higher, bargaining power is higher, and I think we end up having a more equitable society. So it's a win both in terms of the size of the pie, and also I think what most of us would prefer is the distribution of the pie. We can talk more about that later if you'd like, but that's the overall image that I have for where we're going.
Let me just ask you, Nicole, Bledi, do you share Erik's assessment of the disruptions we're likely to see associated with these emerging technologies? It's very much, as I understand what you're saying, Erik, a story not about jobs going away, but about jobs evolving and looking different. Primarily.
And I want to underscore it's not so much a prediction as a choice.
Good.
So it's something that I see people going in different directions, and we have some policies in place that are steering us one way. We have some choices by the managers and the MBAs that I teach, by technologists, and we have a lot more agency than I think people give us credit for.
Bledi or Nicole, do you have reactions to Erik's perspective on this?
Nicole, you can go first.
Sure. So I do think that when we're going out in our case studies, one of the areas we really want to focus on is, the skills of the workers who have been impacted by the technology, any training, and, has the establishments invested in this training for their workers, or is the training being procured by the workers outside of work? Yeah, I mean, I think that, we understand that jobs are bundles of tasks, and that automation is going to impact some of these tasks more than others.
Yeah. And I'm just going to add and say I fully agree. We're mostly seeing skill changes. And the interesting thing is that at least there's been a convergence of even the research community that is not a 0-1. We're not discussing too much about automation taking our jobs. I mean, that was very different 5 years ago. I even had to change my slides. So it's like, automation will take your jobs, automation will not take your jobs. It was interesting in a recent presentation that I had. But we are seeing mostly, it also depends, like even if you see historical data, you see very few jobs that completely disappear, right? If you see, BLS data, for example. But the one thing that it is important is that there are distributional effects because of the technology change and because of the skill changes. So we are seeing effects on wages. We are seeing effects on higher unemployment spells for people that essentially, and so like that, it's important to keep in mind that those type of distribution effects are there. But we're at least not talking anymore about the 0-1 where the robots are taking our jobs.
Okay, I want to turn to some questions that came in, were submitted in advance by the audience that relate to what we're talking about. You said, Erik, that we have a choice about how we pursue these technologies and implement them in the labor market. It's not, different people may have different interests in how this plays out. People who are in the jobs that are being affected may have some of the strongest interests in how this gets done. Do you see a role for unions? How do you see workers' perspective getting factored into the way these decisions are made?
I see an incredibly important role, and one that's often underappreciated. And one of the mistakes I think economists, neoclassical analyses have made the past 20 or 30 years was assuming that not only we would make the pie bigger, but that we do it in a way that almost everybody benefited. And let me make a quick diversion to what happened with trade policy. Most economists think free trade makes the pie bigger. They also recognize there are winners and losers. They said, oh, well, that's easy. It's the pie's bigger. We're going to compensate the people who aren't done as well. We'll retrain them and so forth. And what happened, to oversimplify a bit, was that we did have more free trade, opening China, et cetera. But the people who were hurt were not compensated. And in most cases, were made significantly worse off. We saw devastation of many regions and job occupations and increased deaths from despair, et cetera. And not surprisingly, those people turned against globalization and they said, no, we don't really like this. It's not working out so well for us. My fear is a similar thing is happening or is beginning to happen with technology, where technology can make the pie bigger, but everyone doesn't automatically benefit. And it's in the enlightened self-interest of firm owners, capitalists, CEOs, stockholders, to make sure that other people, the workers, benefit as well. And I don't think they've always held up that part of the bargain. So having unions involved, having worker cooperatives, having government do training and education to make sure people have the new skills that are needed is going to be a big part of having us continue to advance technology. Otherwise, what's going to happen, what's already happening, is there'll be a tech backlash. And I think the worst thing would be is we tried to put the brakes on technology and stop technology advancement. But if we're going to want to have technology advancement, as I think we should, we have to make sure everyone or most people benefit from it. And there's going to be, churn, but in principle, with more productivity and a bigger pie, we can have much more, almost everybody can benefit from it.
So I asked that question one way around, which was, how do you get unions, works councils more of a say in the way that technology is developed and implemented? there's also a question from a different perspective that came in from the audience, which I'll just read it. What trends do you see outside the US, especially in Europe, where works councils and strict employment laws make it hard to drive workforce change? So it seems to me that they're, you know, on the one hand, you want business people who are going to adopt a more enlightened view of what's in their self-interest, but maybe unions, worker representatives need to be doing that too. I don't know if that's something you've thought about, Erik, or
well, yeah, for sure. And it is a two-edged sword. And so we want to have more widespread, you know, shared prosperity, but sometimes unions use that to try to slow down technology. I was visiting an auto plant that was in Detroit that was remarkably not using a lot of advanced technology at all. And I asked why, and the manager said it was union rules were making it very difficult to implement change. In Germany, there are places where work councils are slowing things down. There's other places where they're speeding things up and participating in it. And so you know, the devil is very much in the details. I don't think it's as simple as just, you know, more power or less power, or speed up or slow down. I think it really depends on the choices that are made. I think both management and workers would be better off thinking about how can we make this technology work for everybody broadly, and how can we lean in to embracing these changes, rather than how can we act as, you know, to veto the changes. And it's I see both of those happening in different situations.
Mm-hmm.
My 2 cents, I don't think that the main difference between Europe and US is based on the unions per se, because you know, you can always take the example of Sweden, and there you have the opposite, right? You know, we even did a study, we looked at the adoption of AI, and for example, in Sweden is very almost as the same as in US, right? And then you hear about them that they're not really worried about AI, you know, substituting the jobs, because they are always training the workers and they are caring about it. So I don't think that is necessarily Europe versus US per se. I think unions can play sometimes even a good role. I think in Germany and other places, I think a lot of the differences is entrepreneurial culture or financial infrastructure, which, you know, are some of the main differences between US and Europe. And so, like how you invest in new technologies, exactly, that is a main difference. But again, what Erik said is there's a difference between what you're creating and then how you're taking that and you're distributing, you know, to individuals and to workers. So I think we could, in theory, separate those two. You know, we can somehow, you know, take the role of unions under like negotiating about the distribution percent, not necessarily on the creation part.
I'm not sure I quite understood your point about differences in financing of investments or financial.
Well, I mean, you have the whole venture capital, right, essentially being born in US. And for example, you're not going to see a lot of unicorns in Europe, and especially in Germany per se. And that has to do with the financial culture, financial infrastructure. And essentially, a lot of the time what we're seeing this AI adoption or AI diffusion is because a lot of venture capital. And so that's one of the main differences why we're not seeing a lot of AI diffusion in Europe at this moment. So I wouldn't say that it's per se because of you know, of unionization or other labor market institutions.
Interesting. Other institutional differences. Yeah. So we started out talking about data, Bureau of Labor Statistics data, your data, Bledi. Do we have the data we need to understand how technology is affecting the labor market? And if we don't, what do we need to know that we don't know? Maybe I can ask you this question, Nicole. I know you're thinking about where the holes in BLS data might be.
Yes, I mean, one area that we're interested in further utilizing, actually even existing data that we have, you know, for our occupation requirement survey, we ask establishments. So we have this, you know, representative sample of establishments. We're targeting, you know, key jobs at those establishments, and we ask them what are the critical tasks of those jobs. and we get this open text response, which is this wealth of data that it could give us more information about jobs. And we think that, it has a sort of detail, so you could distinguish like, okay, this whole job won't be replaced by new technology, but what aspects of it and what set of jobs will be impacted by new technologies. But because of the current structure of the data, we're somewhat struggling with what are the dimensions of tasks that are most important to capture if we were to make this data more publicly available. Previous automation was focused on routine, non-routine. But that seems less relevant when we're talking about AI. So what are the dimensions of tasks that we would want to capture in any sort of classification of the tasks that we have?
That seems related to some of the work you've been involved with, Bledi. Can you comment on that?
I mean, I'm going to change it a little bit and say, like, I mean, the one main thing that has been missing a lot is, for me, and actually in Europe, you get some better data, like it's detailed longitudinal data, right? And people have tried to substitute that, for example, Erik in his work with sort of LinkedIn type of data, but the ability to trace individuals over time and to understand their skill accumulation, if I would be sort of my wish list, that would be like the first thing that I would ask, BLS to invest. I mean, related to what Nicole said, I think I would say the two things that are missing from the current research in AI is actually going a little bit deeper. We have overall data, good data about the diffusion of AI and what is happening over time. But we don't have a good classification of what is really AI that is happening in these firms, right? Everything is bundled together, but there's a difference between the ones that are producing AI versus the ones that are consuming AI. And there's also like the implementers of AI, right? And this is just three categories that are made up, but there's probably more. Right now, understanding how those three differences essentially affect the firm and how affect the employees, that is very important, but it's not very easy to distinguish between those. And same thing for the type of AI, right? There's even just general machine learning, and there's very specific like computer vision or other type of more specified AI. Those are not the same, right? But essentially a lot of times they are bundled together. So I think understanding better, the different nuances of AI, that would be sort of my second in the list. And I know Erik probably has a lot more.
Erik, I'm sure you have thoughts about what data we need as well.
Well, we're on the cusp of a real revolution, and Bledi's helping to lead that, where we have a lot more real-time data. We usually did a partnership with ADP at the Stanford Digital Economy Lab. And I'm on the committee of statistics, and along with you and others, and looking at how, for the American Economic Association, looking at how fine-grained real-time data can allow us to understand the economy much better. Now, it has some amazing strengths in terms of detail and timeliness. There's some weaknesses too in terms of representativeness. I mean, these data sets were not designed to be representative the way that the census and the BLS and the BEA are much more careful about trying to do that. So ultimately, I see them as complements, not substitutes. You want to combine them so you have a understanding. You can calibrate, say, that the BGT data or other things to data where we have more representative samples. But I think we're in the early stages of really getting much better understanding of what's happening in the economy. I was talking to some folks at, let me just say, a very large retailer who said we could almost have GDP on like a daily basis, which is amazing. We could have labor metrics on a daily basis. I remember presenting some stuff to the Federal Reserve on housing prices that we gathered from Google. And they were saying, wow, I wish we would have had this during the great financial crisis, because we were looking at data that was 90 days or more old. So this is something that is really going to change what we can do. The other thing I'll just mention briefly is that there's some conceptual issues that I think we're also working on. So I've been doing a lot of work on a concept we call GDP-B, which is a nice complement to existing GDP. Existing GDP, anything that's bought and sold is well represented in that. But if something has zero price, with few exceptions, it has zero weight in GDP. So Wikipedia, or a lot of household production, a lot of other things, they don't show up in GDP, even though they are very valuable to us. And so we need to conceptually think about what are the welfare implications of things that might have very low or zero price, and how can we go about measuring them? So we've instituted a set of massive online choice experiments, again, leveraging digital technologies to get a sense of how much value somebody gets from something versus what they have to pay from it, which you guys are economists, that's a consumer surplus you get from it. And those numbers can be very large and very different from the traditional GDP and therefore productivity metrics. So over the next few years, between the availability of much more fine-grained real-time data and some of these conceptual changes, I think we're going to have a very different understanding of the economy going forward.
I think that's right. Just to pick up on the conversation you had with the person at the Fed, I think this time around with
Ben Bernanke, that was a while ago.
Yeah, this time around in the pandemic recession, the Fed had a whole group that was working on real-time economic indicators to complement the data that they were getting from the official statistical agencies. They had folks there working on using ADP data to monitor week by week what's happening to employment and a variety of other projects. And I think that is changing the kinds of information that decision makers have available. I have argued that that's something that the statistical agencies should be taking on board, and that it would be very valuable as a complement to the official statistics that are the gold standard that we all need as benchmarks, to also be looking at some of this real-time and more granular big data to generate, call them experimental series that can add to our understanding of what's going on.
Exactly. And I think the point that these are complements is really important, because it's not like we can just turn it over, because there's just inevitably big gaps in some of those things. But it's the old saying, you can't manage what you don't measure. And so if we get better metrics, we'll be able to make much better decisions.
Yeah, and I think we almost have to go down that path. You commented, Bledi, that it would be useful to have more detailed data on people's work histories. So I started thinking about a survey, national longitudinal survey. You mentioned that, Nicole. It's tracked people over a long period of time. It's how many people is it in the latest wave? 12,000 people, something like that. There's just no way that the BLS or any of the other statistical agencies are going to be able to field a longitudinal survey that's big enough to get the kind of granularity that I think you want, Bledi. So I think you almost have to complement that survey data with, maybe data from, LinkedIn or some other online source that lets you look at what people's career histories have been. And it's got all kinds of issues and so on, but I almost think we have to go down that path in order to figure out some of this. I don't know if you agree or disagree, but.
No, I agree. And again, there's a lot of research being done exactly using this type of data. I mean, again, understanding career pathways at a granular level is one of the most interesting research questions, but it's not easy to do with available data because lack of granularity and small sample sizes. But...
Yeah. Let me shift gears just a little bit. We've been talking about new technologies as a way to improve productivity and increase the size of the pie. And we talked a little bit, maybe we'll come back to this, about how that pie gets divided up. But as I look at the data, it's not obvious in the aggregate productivity statistics that these new technologies are leading to have yet led to significant improvements in productivity. Erik, I think you've thought about this.
Yeah, it's been one of my favorite things. Actually, my first real paper when I was a grad student, I worked with Bob Solo on the old productivity paradox. Yeah, he made that famous quote, "We see the computer age everywhere except in productivity statistics." And I wrote a paper about what was called the productivity paradox in IT and so forth. And things kind of turned around, as you recall, in the 90s. And I think,
and then they went back to being as bad as they'd been.
Yeah, and then they went down again, and then the past decade or more, Productivity has been about half of what it was during those periods. So it was about 2.8% in the late 90s and early 2000s. And then since then, it's been more like 1.3, 1.4%. So growth, still growing, but much slower than it used to. So that's very disappointing and not a sign of a technological revolution. So what's going on there? I wrote a new paper 20-something, 30 years later called AI and the Modern Productivity Paradox with Chad Severson and Daniel Rock. And we laid out a series of explanations. I won't go through all of them, but the two big ones, one is we were just talking about is measurement. And much of the AI revolution, the computer revolution, is in things that are not measured well in traditional statistics. So that's part of it. But the more I look at it, while we're mismeasuring things now, we also mismeasured things in the past. So it's not so obvious that measurement has gotten dramatically worse in terms of measuring these sorts of value. But that may be a part of it. The more fundamental thing, I think, is what I call the productivity J curve. And what that means is that when you implement new technologies, you rarely, if ever, can just flick a switch and turn everything over. When the steam engine, when electricity, when early computers, and now when AI are implemented, you need to fundamentally rethink how work gets done. And that involves a lot of investment in intangibles and in skills and other complements. Those are costly investments that take time to implement, time to build. And the result is you get a J curve where initially, as you're investing in those complements, you're not seeing output, but you are spending. And then later you start to harvest it. And as best we can calibrate, we wrote a paper in the American Economic Journal Macro on this. We're sort of near the bottom or beginning to turn the corner on that J curve. So it can help explain why we had a bit of a slowdown, but also it suggests optimism going forward. I wrote about it there. I also, to try to put my money where my mouth is, Bob Gordon, that noted technology pessimist, and we've had a long-standing debate about things. He's mostly been right about the past few years, but I continue to be an optimist, and we have a bet that the next 10 years are going to have significantly higher productivity growth as we turn up on that J curve and start harvesting the investments in intangibles and complements we've been making over the past few years.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that partly answers the follow-up question I was going to ask you, which is, okay, so there's lags.
Mm-hmm.
How long do you think these lags are?
Yeah, they're long and variable and hard to predict. So
you could lose your bet with Bob Gordon.
Yeah, he actually wanted to do it out for 10 years. I'm pretty confident 10 years out. I'm hoping it'll be sooner. I have to say, I often get disappointed when the new numbers come out. but there's different layers that overlap at different timescales. So some of the stuff with remote work and with the pandemic, there's some really quick effects. Nick Bloom has measured some companies that switched to remote work and very quickly got some benefits, and hopefully those will magnify over time. And what we saw with the vaccine and other developments, it was just eye-popping how quickly they were able to do it in part because of machine learning techniques that allowed them to do, analyze protein folding and other things much more quickly than we used to be able to in the past. But then the bigger things in the case of electricity, it literally took about 30 years. Paul David documented this pretty well. Yeah. I don't think it's going to take that long this time. I think people are working a lot harder to compress that. There's all these consulting companies like McKinsey and Accenture that are trying to share best practices. People are writing books about it. I'm hoping it'll be a lot faster, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was a decade before we started seeing some of the big benefits from even the existing wave of technology innovations. And then there's new waves. The one I'm very excited about that my colleagues here at Stanford and Silicon Valley are looking at are these very large language models or foundation models. You may have heard of GPT-3 or DALL-E. Mm-hmm. For the first time, some of my AI colleagues are like, for the first time, they're like, wow, we don't even understand why this is working so well. And so they're genuinely impressed with what these systems can do. So there's, it's not stopping. There are new waves of technology coming on, even as we start to learn how to implement the previous one.
So we talked a little bit earlier on about something I want to come back to, which is what the implications of this are for policy. I think you all have said the technology is changing the way that jobs are structured. There's going to be winners and losers. Nicole, you said these changes were as best you could see in the BLS data emerging gradually, but still there's likely to be disruption. I won't ask you this question, Nicole, because I know BLS doesn't do policy, but Erik and Bledi, what do you think the implications of these new technologies and the impacts they're likely to have are for policy, and how should we be thinking about protecting workers who are likely to be harmed?
Why don't you go first, Bledi?
Thank you. So, I mean, I think we need to take a step back there. Right? Obviously, the immediate jump is like we should do training programs, right? But I think we need to do some other things before we go to that. I mean, I think the first thing that is missing actually is labor market literacy. I know this sounds, you know, obvious or simple, but like, you know, a lot of people saying that we need more financial literacy, and I agree. But like, there's research that shows that, you know, most people don't even know what jobs are out there. They don't know what pathways are out there. They don't know what they pay. And so like even just starting from some labor market literacy from school and understanding career pathways and how they pay off, I think that I would start with that, right? The second is that we need to understand more, to do more research, to even do more experiments on what works and what doesn't work in training programs. We know that most of training programs don't work. Like that, there's research about that. We know that some of them work, but also we really don't know what exactly works. And we need to experiment more on that. And so I think that's sort of like the second step, like we need to understand better. And finally, I think we need more simple matching systems that essentially are sort of these three-sided matching platforms in a way that they can match these sort of the three main players, which is employers, employees, and training providers. Today, for example, even if you go to an unemployment agency, that doesn't work in an automated way. But you can build a simple system where somebody goes there, they have their resume that gets read, and there are the employers that are offering jobs. You can connect them, but so you can say, hey, you're missing these 5 skills, and you can go to this training provider. So I would build a simple matching system that is matching these sort of 3 main players. And then I would go to what training we should offer. But before we're doing these 3 things that are basic, I wouldn't go to the very deep policy. There are obvious policy implementations there that we have not done, and I think there are they could be very fruitful.
Yeah. So just to pick up on your first point before I turn to Erik, I couldn't agree with you more on labor market literacy being important. I think that shows up in all kinds of ways. The Bureau of Labor Statistics does have a product that guidance counselors across the countries turn to, which is the Occupational Outlook Handbook. So that's a little piece of the labor market literacy is that. But I think you're right that a lot of people don't really have a very good sense of what kind of jobs are out there and what jobs are growing in importance and so on. I mean, I think it shows up in the educational decisions that people make too, that are often not well grounded in where the opportunities are likely to be. I said I wasn't going to call on you, Nicole, but I don't know if you want to add anything on this information point.
Yeah, I mean, the Occupational Outlook Handbook is the most visited part of the BLS website, so it's certainly well referenced.
Erik, do you have thoughts about policy?
Well, first, I want to underscore what you said. I mean, this is a tragedy. It's a $200 trillion tragedy. That's the value of the human capital in the United States. I mean, it's staggering, and people are not taking advantage of the knowledge that already exists to make better decisions in terms of where they invest their training and education. And the matching is horrible. And I'll give you a little anecdote because it's better than data. My niece graduated from college, and she wanted to be an economist. She asked me for some advice. So I asked her to make some introductions, and I think the sad part of the story is I actually made some introductions and she got a job through my introductions. It's sad because, I mean, that's not the way it should work. You know, she shouldn't call up her uncle and then have, you know, that's like so 19th century or 17th century. We should have matching platforms that, look, I don't know the courses she took very well. I mean, there should be ways that we can better calibrate what her skills are and what the job are, and all the hundreds of millions of job opportunities out there, which one's best for her, not the handful of people who I know. So it's a sign that we aren't having the tools as available as they could be. And when you think about, you know, if $200 trillion worth of human capital, if we could make that 1%, 2%, 3% more efficient, I mean, you do the math, it adds up pretty quickly. And I think we should be doing that. I've started a company called Work Helix, which is based using some of the data from Bledi and others to understand what is the value of different skills and skill adjacencies. You may have a set of skills that is a near miss for some of the opportunities. With a little bit of training or a little bit of repurposing, you can move from something where you're not a good fit to something you are a good fit. Think of how much better that can be for the individuals, for the employers, for the economy as a whole. So we have a huge opportunity there. We you know, there's all sorts of tools out there for measuring the value of, I don't know, used cars or whatever, but the most important asset by every measure is human capital, and we haven't taken full advantage of that yet. So this is something we can change. I mean, on the policy front, so that I'm underscoring what you both have already said, all three of you already said. I'll just also underscore that the education and training, we aren't doing a great job in that. And then last but not least, I'll mention that our tax policy and our investment policy is weirdly skewed. We have a huge incentive for investing in capital rather than labor. We have preferential tax rates on capital investment versus labor or human capital, I would call it. And so, you know, we're wondering why we have excess incentives for automation. Well, the tax code has its thumb on the scale very heavily in that direction. I'm not sure what the logic is for that. It doesn't have great distributional effects. It isn't probably what we should be doing. So we could have a much more level playing field and have more investment in human capital if we address those three things I just mentioned.
Yeah. Just to pick up on follow up on some of what you said. Both you and Bledi talked about doing a better job of matching people to jobs. You were worried that you didn't know as much about your niece's record as you should, and you maybe couldn't make the best recommendation for her. But then there's all these people who don't have you for an uncle.
No, exactly. No, I think it's so unfair.
It's so unfair. I mean, it's so inefficient.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I don't know all the jobs out there. I you know, Bledi list, what do you list? 100 million, like, you know, millions of job openings out there. And like, I know a tiny fraction of them. So there's zero chance that I recommended the optimal job to her or anybody's getting it. But so that's a kind of a tragedy, not just for her, but for all the people who are out there who could be matched to something that's more fulfilling for them and creates more value for society.
The interesting thing, one of the interesting things in the way that you phrased this, Bledi, was that it's not just finding somebody who's a perfect match for an existing job, but finding ways to identify gaps in people's skills that could relatively easily be filled if they could be matched with an appropriate, in most cases, short-term training program. And I think that's a really interesting way to look at this.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we think that better, this is sort of three-way, you know, three-sided matching instead of the two-sided matching, I think it will work more optimally because it will increase the efficiency, right, of the market. But like, you can think that this is not just a, you know, a problem of developed countries. We see this in, for example, right now there's a large influx, for example, of immigrants in a lot of places, and they might not have directly the skills. So you want to assimilate them, but you know, you can do that with some type of upskilling, right? So essentially being able to do that in an efficient way, I think that's sort of like the bigger picture solution. Instead of just saying you are best fit for this job and you're going to, and you're going to match. So I think you need all three sides of the market, both the employers, employees, and training providers to be able to triangulate between the three of them.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting perspective on this. Well, we have covered a lot of territory, and there's lots more that we could talk about, but we are approaching the end of our time. Let me just ask if any of the three of you have one last thing you want to say that I didn't ask you about and should have, or any observation you wanted to make.
Well, let me just wrap up by saying, I mean, I'm awed by the power of the technologies that are being developed right now, and my very smart colleagues that are helping to develop them in technology. But the big gap is what we've been talking about here, is how do we use those tools to change organizations and skills to create value. And that's where there's a big gap. We created the center, the Digital Economy Lab to try to address that gap and understand more how the tools could change the economy and the workforce. So I'm really glad you guys are having this session here, and hopefully we'll all make progress on that question in the coming years.
Yeah, that's probably a good note to end our formal conversation on. I do want to thank all three of you for taking time. I know how busy you all are for taking time to talk about this. I also would say that these issues are very much central to the work that the Block Center is doing, and they are organizing a variety of convenings to look at these issues. I think there's a slide here that mentions the next event coming up on the Block Center calendar, which is a conference on the future of work being held on October 7th. And I know there are additional things in the works. Let me thank again all of the panelists and all of you who joined us today, and I look forward to future conversations around these issues. Thank you all very much.